In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, even as we gather together today, there is a convoy or a number of convoys moving across the United States, converging on Washington, D.C. This is a convoy of Trump supporters gathering to time their arrival in Washington for the Feast of Epiphany on the 6th of January, on this coming Wednesday. Now, I don't think this convoy is particularly interested in the revelation of Christ to the Gentiles. They are gathering in Washington on the Feast of Epiphany to oppose Congress's constitutional obligation to affirm the decision of the Electoral College to confirm Joe Biden as the next President of the United States. Donald Trump's lawyer has now suggested that the Vice President, Mike Pence, be arrested, tried and executed for treason because he hasn't supported the legal attempts that Donald Trump has made to avoid losing the election. Power does not like to be relinquished. Power is a very jealous lover indeed. It is a story that is as old as humanity itself. And it is the story that we have before us today, the story of Epiphany, the story of the Magi. But we cut the story short when we tell it. And therefore we miss the meaning and the power of that story. We infantilise the story. It's a lovely little story of the wise men coming to Bethlehem and laying their gold and their frankincense and their myrrh in front of the crib of the baby Jesus. And if we leave it just at that, it's a lovely little children's story, and we have little statues around the altar telling that story. But because we leave the story there, that the wise men, having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they go home by another way. It's a lovely little nativity story, a lovely little kids' story, and we infantilise it. And making it just that, ending the story just there, we domesticate it, and we emasculate it, and we debilitate it, and we obfuscate it. And we miss the point of the story. What's happening in the United States at the moment is really quite frightening, as these convoys of armed people converge on Washington. It's equally frightening if, like me, you have a daughter living in the United States. But this story, the story of Epiphany, the full story, is equally frightening. And it isn't a story for children. After the wise men leave for their homes by another way, Matthew writes, "Now after they left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Get up and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother by night and fled to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod." Now Matthew tells us why he tells the story in this way. He goes on to say, "This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. 'Out of Egypt I have called my son.'" Matthew goes on When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. That's what happens when power is thwarted, when power is challenged, when power is threatened. He was infuriated. And he sent and killed the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. That's what power does when it's threatened. It threatens right back, and it often threatens the most innocent, most vulnerable. There's a Chinese saying that is, I think, being lived out in our world today, that you kill one to frighten 100. That's what Herod does. Then we are told, then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. A few weeks ago, Saturn and Jupiter aligned in our skies. And there was a bright single star in the firmament. And of course, happening at this time of year, everybody speculated whether this was the star that the Magi followed. Of course, totally missing the point of the story. And when we only tell half the story, it is easy to miss the point of the story. Matthew writes this story for one reason, and for one reason only: to declare that this child, to declare that Jesus is the new Moses, the new leader, the one who will lead the people through the wilderness, the one who will lead the people into the new salvation event. Moses led the people out of Egypt. So Matthew has to put Jesus back. Somehow he's got to get into Egypt so that he can come out of Egypt. And he confirms the idea because of the story of Moses. Pharaoh felt threatened because the Hebrews were growing great in number, and his advisors come to him and said, "Pharaoh, there are getting too many of these Hebrews. If we don't do something about it, they'll rise up and they'll take over, and we will lose our power." So Pharaoh devises a strategy that he will kill the firstborn male of every Hebrew parent. And we know the story. The midwife saves Moses and puts him in a little wicker basket and shoves him out into the Nile, where he's found by Pharaoh's daughter. Matthew is retelling that story. That's why if we don't tell the whole story, we miss the point of Herod killing all the children around Bethlehem. Matthew's saying this is Pharaoh and this is Moses. This will be the one who leads us into the salvation event. Moses led the people into the salvation event of the Exodus through the wilderness to the promised land. This child will do precisely that, will lead us into the salvation event of the death and resurrection. But because we domesticate the story, we emasculate the story, we debilitate the story, and we obfuscate the story loses its message and its power. It is the story of the entire gospel. It is not the story just of personal salvation, but the story of the salvation of the whole world. Because the Magi are foreigners, and they open up this salvation event not just to the Jewish people, but to the entire world. When Matthew gets to the end of the story, at the beginning of the story, the world symbolically has come to Jesus. When Matthew gets to the end of the story, he has Jesus tell his disciples, "Go into all the world and baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." And this baptism is not just a way of becoming a member of the club, as we so often think of it. It's not just a passport to get into heaven. But this baptism is entering into death and resurrection. The ultimate letting go, relinquishing, disavowing of power, even power over our own lives. That is what death and resurrection is about. It is trusting in the truth that when we let it all go, when we relinquish it all, there is a new kind of life waiting for us. But we can never have that new kind of life until we have totally let go of the old kind. That is the antithesis of what is happening in this story with Herod. It is the antithesis of what's happening in what's going on in the United States. It is the antithesis of the kingdom that Jesus preached, the kingdom brought about by the total relinquishing of power, in the sure and certain hope that there is something more powerful, more equitable, more just around the corner. But this story doesn't begin with the powerful. It begins with the powerless. A little child in a backwater town, in a shed, laying in a food trough. This story doesn't begin with Trump or with Herod. This story begins with us. As Eleanor Roosevelt said when she held up as a photo of her holding up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the great universal charter of a different way of being. And she says, this, as she holds it up, means nothing unless it is lived out in the small places, close to home. And so this, in a sense, means nothing. In this sense, it is personal, because it is about us. It starts with us. What are the little petty power plays in our lives? What are the little things that we refuse to relinquish, to let go of, to die, so that we might enter into resurrection and new life? What are those little petty power things that we play out in our personal relationships at home, in our workplaces, in our communities? Unless we begin to let those things go, what is happening in the United States will continue to happen. Unless they are lived out in the small places close to home, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, the kingdom will never, ever be made manifest. Now, I'm not talking about allowing abuse to... I'm not talking about being a doormat or allowing abuse to continue in personal relationships. That's not what I'm talking about. Because non-violent resistance, non-violent direct action is an example of disavowing the power plays, of not perpetuating violence against violence and abuse against abuse. So it's not about being powerless. about being powerful, but not in the way the world understands power. What are the little ways in our own personal relationships, at home, in our workplaces, in our friendships? What are the ways in which we are refusing to die, to let go of power, and to enter into a new way of being? In this way, it is personal and also universal. But unless we begin that in our own lives, the world will never be saved, because the world will never be able to embrace the salvation event of death and resurrection. The Lord be with you.